Hello, and welcome back to the channel. We have another mix walkthrough today, but before we begin, just want to make it clear that the multi-tracks as well as the original mix, all credit for those go to the respective owners as well as another YouTuber, and I will put that link in the description below in case you guys want to download the multi-tracks for yourself, just like I did, and take a run at them. So, with that out of the way, let's listen to the mix of the song that I did and listen what we will be working towards. Alright, so we have some synth metal to work with. Kind of new territory for me, but regardless, let's get right into it. First thing is first, hit the magic button down here, and we will turn all of the processing off. And now let's listen. What a difference, huh? Well, that's okay, because now we're going to go through and see how it was done. So, what we will start off with first are these tracks called kick spikes, snare spikes, tom spikes, floor spikes, and guitar spikes. Note that if you download the multi-tracks for yourself through the link in the description, these tracks will not come with it. These are tracks that I made to help me do the mix. And I'm going to play one of those for you real fast. I'll go with the kick spike. And I want you to tell me if you notice anything particular about it. They line up perfectly. And that was the goal of these tracks. So every time there's a kick, we have a corresponding MIDI note. Now, this MIDI goes across all of the drum shells, and we could do a lot of different things with it. We could add samples if we wanted to. We could use them to key certain effects like compressors, gates, multibands. And there's a ton you can do with these, and you'll see exactly how I use them. Now, you're probably not wondering, but since I put a couple days into pre-production of this before I mixed it, the total number of kick spikes, 1,225 in this track. The snare has 431, the rack spike 12, the rack 2 spike 22, and the floor spike has 13. Now, I won't make a video and show you me lining all of these up by hand, but trust me when I say these are 100% accurate. And I made sure of that wherever the note starts, then so does the MIDI. And that is across all of these. Now, that may sound boring, but if you want this technique to work, sometimes you have to put in the time to get it right, because very rarely is there a plugin that will result in 100% accuracy. Now, there is Trigger and Trigger 2, which converts audio to MIDI, and can do a very good job if programmed correctly. But in my opinion, at least at this point in time, nothing beats going in and altering everything by hand if you want accuracy. And to show you how accurate these are, I'm going to activate the kick spike, activate the gate on the kick, and this gate is sidechained to the kick spike. So the gate has to look at that to determine when to open and when to close. So I'm going to enable the duck feature. So in theory, if this is 100% accurate, like I said, we will not hear any part of the kick whatsoever. Pretty accurate. And that was the goal for it. So, to get those out of the way, the kick spikes sidechain to the snare to the kick gate, snare spikes sidechain to the snare gate, same with the toms, and we will get to the guitar spike later. And so I don't forget, I'm going to activate all those gates right now, because that's what they're there for. So, starting with the kick, this is the raw kick sounds we were given. Okay, well, I'm gonna activate the limiter so that doesn't happen again. And mute the key spikes since we don't need to hear them, we just need to tell the gates what to look at. Alright, so the first thing, compression. We want to even those kicks out. A very minor change. And I'm gonna boost this just so we can hear it better. So now the kicks are evened out. Next plugin is a free one I got recently called Diablo Lights. Now, they have a paid version of this, but I saw this plugin reviewed on a bunch of hip-hop tracks, making everything punchier, so I thought why not get it for myself, just download it, and see how that would work for drum shells. And because I know what this does, I'm gonna preemptively turn the limiter down a bit. And let's open this back up and listen to the night and day difference. Now, aside from having, I think, one of my personal favorite art to look at, it does a good job. Now, if you don't have this plugin, like I said, you could download it for free, or you would just dial in your compressor, play with the attack and release times, as well as the input gain to get that punch. But the reason I used Diablo is because I just recently got it, and I wanted to experiment with it. And it did a great job. Next step, EQ. Here we boosted some low and high end. So some of the sub. And notice how that changes the texture in the high end. Just makes it sound like more of a kick. There's really no other way to say it. So we have our kick. Now what we need is some reverb on the kick. So the first thing I did was I added reverb. Now this is just the stock reverb that comes with Studio One. And let's listen to what it did. So it doesn't blend with the kick we have as much as I would like it to. So what I did was I put an EQ at the beginning, get rid of some of the highs. Because for the reverb, I don't really want a lot of detail in it. I want it to be more washy of the original source. So that's what we took out. And we also added a little bit of gain at the bottom, just so we would hear it. And then after that, a typical reverb move I will do is take out some of the lows, because, I mean, we just don't need a bunch of mud in the reverb mic, since most of that's going to be provided by the close mic. So now, instead of just what sounds like a sampled kick, based on the fact that there's no bleed, we now have created an artificial space for that drum to live in. Now the snare is no exception. So let's hear what that sounds like. And now we hear the bleed. So that's how valuable the Keyspike is to me. That's what it does. So what do we do after that? A little bit of EQ. We wanted to add some body and roll off some of the lows. Now remember, these don't all have to be night and day differences. Sometimes subtle moves are the way to go. Next thing I did, compression. We want to make the hits even. After that, we have some EQ. Now, I know these look like extreme moves, especially at the 30 decibel viewpoint, but I'll actually start with it on, bypass it, and then you'll see why they were necessary. Now tell me those frequencies weren't annoying to you. And in case you didn't hear them, I'm going to solo them. That was 1. That was 2. And then kind of similar with the kick, what we did was boosted some top end also. Some of the texture, and some of the higher end also. And then lastly, we have Saturn for saturation. Now, just a heads up, this is going to sound weird at first, but I'll explain why I made this choice when I get to the overheads in a minute or so. Alright, just be warned that this is going to turn it into what sounds like more of a snare bottom mic. That was intentional. So let's listen. So now we have all these effects. Now imagine what it would sound like if there was bleed in that. So we would have, let's see, 1845. Yeah, we would have been distorting a lot of the cymbal bleed within that snare mic. Once again, another reason for the Keyspikes. And then, similar to the kick, the snare reverb. Once again, we just added the stock reverb. And kind of like the kick, it didn't fit right off the bat. So we added some EQ to make it fit. We got rid of the fundamental as well as the texture that we created with Saturn. So there's the fundamental. As well as adding the same amount of gain that we did to the kick reverb too, to help make it consistent. So now we have our kick and our snare. And without reverb, there's just no space. So, now that we have a good fundamental of the drum kit, next thing I did was I moved on to overheads. This one is the stereo overhead. This one is the center overhead. And in doing so, I found out that the snare was out of phase with both of these. So I flipped it, and we got a lot more body out of the snare. But listen to the snare in the overheads as well. There's a lot of snare body in that. And that's consistent throughout this track, the other overhead track, and even some of the rooms. So that was my decision for making the snare top mic have a lot more texture, because I was able to manipulate these. Actually, I didn't even have to manipulate them that much, because these just had what sounded like a lot of snare body, since overheads are placed above the snare, which, in my opinion, is the closest you can get to picking up what a snare naturally sounds like if you were in the room with it. So it was easier to view the mix, as these three provide the snare top sounds, and I can alter this to make the snare have what we would hear from a snare bottom mic. So that's what I did. So, the overheads. We cut the sub, we don't want that in there. And then the same snare frequencies that we took out of the close mic were also picked up by the overheads and the rooms. So that's what you're going to notice. So, same story with this one. Just cut the sub and take out the snare frequency. And in case the snare isn't bugging you there, I'll turn on the compressor so you can hear the frequencies as well as I do. So, same move here, cutting the sub. Which, yeah, you're not going to hear it there, but it's in the rest. Snare fundamental. The second one. This one. Then the painful 4K. And there's the sub. Now, if we turn all of these off, listen to how much those snare frequencies that we took out build up. So now, kick, snare, overheads, and rooms. Now with the overheads and rooms, it was easy to solo these, and then slowly bring up the hi-hat and bounce it in. And the only thing with the hi-hat is that there were a couple of snare frequencies in there that we mentioned from before. And I'm going to put the mix in mono real fast so we can listen to it. Getting rid of the snare and the kick. Kind of a submarine sound. Man, that was another one that I didn't want. And when I'm saying that I didn't want these, the way I'm doing that is, well, I'll just add another instance and deactivate this one for a second. The way I'm judging that is I hear it with my ear. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But, well, like guitars are a good example. If there is a frequency that's always there, even though the guitar is changing notes. So like 4K is a good example. You'll hear that on a lot of guitar recordings, electric guitar. And that frequency is always there no matter what the guitar player is doing. Those are the ones you want to look for. So I'm hearing one in the hi-hat right now. That. I think it's that one. So 545 is that one we did here. 563. Okay. So that's an example of how I find those. So now we have everything in the drums but the toms. So I'm going to keep the mix in mono. But what we already did is sidechain the gates to the proper kick spikes. And then we compress all the toms to make the hits evenly. To make the hits sound even. And then for tom 1, we added Saturn. Well, I should take care of the kick spike. That's not the best example. So without, with. Sort of fills in the mids right there. And the last thing was an EQ, and it was a bunch of frequencies similar to how I showed you that I found in the hi-hat, as well as reducing the fundamental to make the sounds more even. So just a little bit of tone shaping there. And that goes to the reverb. The second tom, we added Saturn also. Sort of a similar trick, but we did it a little higher up. Then the EQ, reduce the low end a little bit, and then there was a higher frequency that was standing out to me. And now that higher one stands out to you. And the final one, we'll go to the floor tom for it. After sending that one to the reverb, gate, compression, and our good old friend, the Pro Q. Again, reducing the fundamental, and then notching frequencies that stood out. Let's see if there's a better tom hit. So on, off. And another higher one. All those toms go to the reverb. And similar to the other one, the reverb didn't fit, so we EQ'd it. And here we just had to take out the low end since we tamed the high ends within the tracks itself. And now it fits a lot better. I should have done a fade after that one, but that's okay. So now, mix back in stereo. For the cymbals bus, there we were seeing if there was any frequency buildup we didn't like, and there was just one thing, almost at 4K. Then for the entire drum bus, we just did some compression. So with the drum bus and all of the Keyspikes. And without reverb. It makes it all sound like it was in the same room, which is what I like about it. So, on to bass. First thing we're going to do is listen to the raw track. Alright, so that's what we have to work with. So the first thing we did was compression. Because if we look at the track itself, it was not recorded with a compressor on the way in, or else these tracks would be completely level. So we're trying to even that out with the compressor. Now, we're not using the compressor to add volume, which is why you're not hearing a drastic difference. We're just trying to even it out. So, the next plugin, Parallax. This is the ultimate weapon to mixing bass, because you have to work very, very hard to make this plugin sound bad. Now, with that, we had some EQ we needed to do. We needed to add some low ends, as well as cut at 200, so that the snare punches through. Now, the last trick with this bass is another reason for the kick spike. Now, that is because whenever this kick spike hits, it is going to duck the bass at 66 Hz and below, so it doesn't interfere with the kick audio track itself. And because the kick is such a short sound, our ears are not going to be able to pick that up. So we have the kick muted now, but as you know, the song starts with 4 kick drums, and then everything comes in. And you will see this duck 4 times when I play the song right now. And then if we bring the kick in, now just to show you what that sounds like, let's take a listen of what is being ducked out of the way. A lot of sub. So that is our bass taken care of. So now drums, Keyspikes, bass. Now, on to guitars. Let's listen to what those sound like. Alright, so we have gates also. Now, why would we have gates on the guitars? Like, there's not going to be a lot of bleed. So, why would we do that? We have a guitar spike. And what the guitar spike is doing is it is ducking the guitar bus whenever it is there. So because we have the kick bus all the way down at 0, when I play it and the spike hits, it's going to sound like a glitch, but I promise you it isn't. Now, you could not only use that for a really cool effect if you don't have a tremolator plugin or something similar, but I will reveal the purpose for that as soon as we are done with the guitar bus. So for now, we will mute one guitar, put the mix in mono, and go from there. So the first step, compression. The palm mutes are a lot louder than the chords. We need to even that out. And notice how it's only stomping down on the plugins, and we're not hearing a giant volume boost. That's intentional. I'm going to boost the limiter just a tiny bit more. Alright. So the final thing on the individual guitar tracks, we have an EQ. We are cutting off some sub, some low end to make room for the bass and the kick. We are cutting off some high ends because it sounds like white noise up there, and we just don't need that. There was a frequency that I found that never went away no matter what notes the guitar was playing, so we notched that. And then we have a dynamic EQ to once again help control the palm mutes, but at the frequency level. So that's the sub we're taking out. And I'm really gonna have to boost this so you guys can hear it. So hopefully you can. If not, you're not missing much. We have just above 4. And then this. Now when it comes to this, it will only stomp down on the palm mutes to help make those even. And I dialed it in as such. And the way to do that is you go to the Pro Q, you click this button, and it'll bring up your threshold. And you just raise or lower it to where it stomps down only on the palm mutes, and there you go. So, for the most part, but it's also there as security in case that frequency gets too out of control. So, because both guitars were the exact same, it was just as simple of copy and paste the settings, put the mix back in stereo, and bring everything in. Now, I will say when I was mixing this for real, I turned both of the guitar tracks up, and then as I added more plugins to the bus, I continued to turn them down to help adjust for the gain staging. So I'm going to play these in context, because if I just solo the guitars and add these, it won't make as much sense. So the first thing, Saturn, we wanted to add some saturation to these because this helps the guitars cut through everything else. Because right now they don't sound like they blend, they sound like they're too quiet. But you have to ask yourself, is that a volume issue or a frequency issue? Sometimes it's both, and this was one of those cases. But just some simple saturation helps those cut through a lot more. Now, next thing, the Pultec. Now this is one of those plugins where if you throw it on the track and do not touch any of the settings, it will alter your mix. Like it has its own just resting character to it. So we could have left everything at the default setting, bypassed it, and we would have gotten different sounds. But what I decided to do was boost some low ends and then boost some 5K for some extra frequencies I wanted. Now you definitely noticed the 5K if you noticed that the texture was cutting through. Then after that, an EQ. I heard pretty much some 4K, so we took that out of there. Next, SSL. Here, we're adding some more 5K. Because even though this will be, the fourth EQ in all of the guitar tracks, all of these EQs are different. Some add their own character to it, some don't. The Fab filter does not add a character, that I'm aware of. The Pultec does. The SSL does. So I wanted the characteristic of the Pultec, which sounds to be some saturation to my ear, and I wanted those in certain frequencies. The SSL adds kind of a bit of a static characteristic. And when I say static, I mean like literal, like white noise static. So to find that and to help bring that out in the guitars, I just boosted all the way up and swept around here until I thought it blended well. So I did that in the high end, where I know I can get that results, and then I boosted some low end at 80, because that's where we cut the guitars on the individual tracks, and it's to help add some of the low end back in. And that does the job well. Last thing, Pro MB. Now, full disclosure, I thought I was done with the guitars when I was mixing it at this point. I brought in the synths and they were covering up the guitars. So I added this at the very end and boosted some of the mids and high mids to help it cut through. I also boosted some of the extreme top to help complement the boost I made here. And then I added this one to help control the palm mutes just that much more. So it may sound like the guitars were over-processed with this, but when the synths come in, it's going to sound perfectly balanced. So staff frequency right there, that helps it cut through. So we are compressing this, we are expanding this, and compressing this one. Now, the purpose of the guitar spike. Those were strategic, it's basically a duplicate of the snare spike. So whenever I want the snare to cut through and be one of the focuses on the mix, that's what that was for. So especially in the opening of the song, the guitars are ducking to make room for the snare. Kind of, and see, how do I say this? The snare is cutting through the guitars because of the guitar spike. And we dipped 200 hertz in the bass to help make the snare poke through also. But the reason the guitar spike isn't in every section of the song is because they work together. But on certain parts, like this one, I wanted it to stand out. So there it doesn't stand out as much, here it does. Alright, it's strategy. And then we have a lead guitar for 2 sections, and that was just a matter of cutting some sub and cutting some of the high-end fizz. I love when I forget about the loops. So, everything is done but synths and vocals. So when it came down to the synths, that was kind of a puzzle. So, if you decide to do this track, think of it like this. Start with the synth that is in the song the most, that takes up the most space. Get a good balance of that. And then you have to ask yourself, which synths have to be blended in with it? So with synth 2, every other synth, except for number 3, has to work with it. So let's listen to number 2. Alright, so synth 2 was my starting point. So we added an EQ. We didn't need a lot, we just needed to get some of the sub out of the way. Well, it's not even sub at 92, just some of the low ends that may interfere with. Let's see, what's below 92? Guitars, bass, kick. Yeah, just get it out of the way of that. Now, because I know this mix, I listened to all the synths and found that number 5 was what I needed to mix next, because that's the same pattern, just an octave apart. So we applied the same EQ to that, and now we have 2 synths. Now number 4, an orchestral pad to kind of act as a texture underneath the synths. God, I absolutely love orchestral stuff. So, as far as treating it, cutting off the low ends. And that one's not even registering as much. I promise this won't blow out your ears. But I can't promise that it wasn't going to blow out mine. That was the low end, and then this was some of the fizz in the high ends. And then just getting rid of those made it sound smoother. And yeah, that's why we did it. So now this is what we have. Now, I'm sure you're hearing the high-pitched frequencies that still remain like I am, but I'll get to those in a second. Next was the first synth. Now this one doesn't carry the melody, so that tells me it's meant to be more of a texture. So we did the same thing with the EQ in terms of adding it, but we boosted some low ends. Now, that doesn't make sense now since we've cut low ends out of literally every other synth, but it will when we get to the end of the song. You just gotta trust me on that. The next was all 4 of these together had to equal the volume of synth 3. And obviously, if you're going through the song, you're going to have to listen to all of this and make sure that you don't have to do any automation, because 90% of the time, a fader balance will get you most of the way there. But for synth 3, let's listen. Okay, there are some overtones in there that almost sound like some modulation. Now, that will never be controlled by an EQ unless you automate those EQ points. So, the solution for that, a multiband. I'm going to play that part of the song again and follow along with the mouse. It's going to look like a crowd in a sports arena doing a wave. Take a look. Alright, one EQ move won't be able to do that. So by putting a multiband in there, we essentially have a mix that automates itself. And when I found that out, the higher frequencies I was hearing in Synths 2 and 5, I did the exact same thing for them. And it did the trick. And then the final thing on the synth bus was playing all the synths together. And then taking care of some frequencies that got in the way. Because I would much rather have to do 3 cuts on the bus EQ than try and notch literally every single one instead of the multiband. So, I don't like how these 3 sounds, and when I play it, you won't either. But that's part of the process. I'm sure those notes belong in a song somewhere, but it's not this one. And then we did another cut at 200 Hertz. And we're not taking away anything significant, we're just dipping it by 3 decibels to make room for the snare. Because that move, like, I didn't feel the need to have a snare spike also. This may not make sense, but we don't want to go overboard. I mean, especially with what was the Keyspikes? That was 1,225. I don't want to add any more of these than I have to. So one EQ move just saves maybe a couple hours worth of work. And then we have an effects boom. In real life, I added this when everything was mixed, just to help it blend in more. But here's what that sounds like. Well, you know what? Let's just do it with everything else so far. So, whenever I think I have a good instrumental mix, that's when I'll do some master bus processing. So if you've noticed, all of the major buses go to a pre-master bus. And that's what this is. So without getting ahead of myself, I added compression, because I want to help use that to glue this together. So I don't even think we're hitting over a decibel on this, but we're leaving room for when the vocals come in. This is just so I know the mix is being controlled. All right, because when the vocals come in, I don't want to hit more than 4 decibels of gain reduction. Next, the Pultec again. I like what this did on the guitars and its character of saturation, so I added it on everything. that simple boost at 100 Hz just brings the guitars to life, and the bass for that matter. Lastly, pre-master bus. It's still a bus. So we gotta notch any frequencies that are there that we don't want. And in addition to a boost in the low end, that's what we did. This is the one you were hearing. That sounds like part of the snare. And a low end boost. So, after that, I put on metric AB. And the reason I won't do that now is because for whatever reason that likes to allow audio out of my monitors, but not to get recorded by the software I'm using. But I referenced it against other mixes that have synths. I use Alone in a Room by Asking Alexandria and the song Zero by Crown the Empire. And what I found was that my mix was way too dark. So I put on this EQ, it brightened it up, and then I also brought up some of the sub, so it made the whole thing still retain even consistency across the higher and lower frequencies. Now, if you don't have this EQ, go to Plugin Alliance right now in a new tab and download it for free. This will save you. If I didn't have it on this mix, it would have turned out very, very different. And truth be told, I probably wouldn't be making a video on how I did it. So this plugin is on right now. When everything hits at the same time, I'm going to take it off and you'll understand why it's so valuable. Like I've always said throughout this video, it doesn't have to be a night and day difference, but this one is the exception because it does it so well. Like, it brings everything to life, and it's just 5 decibels at 20,000 hertz, and 6 decibels at whatever sub is. So now I know it can compete with some of the professional mixes out there. But if I didn't have metric AB to tell me that, well, very different video. So, next thing I did after that was I put Span on there just for fun. This is another free plugin, and what you can do if you're a Windows user, hold the control button and then hold your mouse down and you can listen to specific frequencies, which I like to use to reset my ears, especially if I'm just listening to bass. Then I can do that, listen to the high end, and it kind of resets my ears for me. And then down there, the correlation meter, everything is in phase. Beautiful. And as I swept up to the high end and used the scroll feature of the mouse to narrow and widen the bands, it sounded smooth in the highs, which is fantastic. Like if we were to put the SSL here, it would be a very different story. Trust me, I've tried. I would not recommend it. And the last thing right before the limiter, a clipper. This adds a little bit more gain, a little more saturation going into the limiter itself. And yeah, it just acts as a little bit of a volume boost without consequences. So now we have a mix that's pretty loud. So we have some artifacts going on, but we're not even hitting -1 on the limiter, so I'm okay with it. Lastly, vocals. These vocals were not compressed on the way in. There they are. So let's listen to what we have. So, we need to add compression. And my go-to, especially in extreme situations like this where there needs to be a lot of compression, gain reduction. The other thing with vocals, you need to make room in the mix for them. Cut out everything that you don't need. That's what we did. Lastly, a de-esser to take care of the S's or any other harsh frequencies that are in there. Now we have a much more consistent vocal. And what I mean by the de-esser, watch whenever the attenuation comes down. Pay attention to what sounds the vocalist is making when that happens. Well, it would help if I had the right instance on it. So, that was the vocal chain I used across all of these vocalists. And there are a bunch of them. The only thing that was custom to each one was where I put the high pass filter, because some are singing in, or screaming in this case, in different registers, and the amount of compression needed also varied. But now we have this. Thought I know all the answers, but now they are lost to me. Much more consistent vocals, which is a wonderful starting point to have. All of those go into a scream bus, where we have additional compression, and then to really pin the vocals in their place, we have the Devil Lock, which is a very aggressive limiter, where we have crunch, which is distortion at just under 1, and a bunch of crush, which is the actual limiting being applied. Now, even though the distortion being added by the Devil Lock is extremely audible, keep in mind, like the multiband we did with the guitars, that's going to help them cut through. Alright, so even with the synths here, like short delay and other ones, those are subtle. Those help them cut through, make space. In other words, they affect the vocal, but they're not effects that are meant to be heard, at least in this case. Now, we continued the same vocal chain throughout the pan vocals. And then we have Devil Lock here, as well as micro shifts, which adds some stereo effect. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but it kind of gave a little more width, and then that is going into the limiter with some of the darkness applied, which basically rolls off the high end to some extent. No distortion, no crush. I felt like it was crushed enough with the gain reduction, and then even if it wasn't, we applied a compressor after it. My game was such a lie. Thought I know all the answers, but now they are lost to me. Now the vocals blend together pretty well. So let's hear it. Well, look at that. We have actual singing in this track. So, these tracks they were my biggest problem in the mix. Not from an arrangement perspective, but dialing in the compression just right because they are extremely dynamic, as you can see. Like this part alone compared to this part.
If you can find it in your heart, if you can find it in your heart.
Like, don't get me wrong, it's a wonderful performance, but we need to control it, much like we've done with everything else. So, gain reduction to the rescue.
If you can find it in your heart.
Much, much better. And what are we hitting on it?
If you can find it in your heart.
Just past 10. Lastly, well, second to lastly, EQ. Cut off what we don't need, and then I also boosted some mids. Because this vocal, without any processing, sounded like it was recorded in a very, very soundproof environment. Which, don't get me wrong, is very much appreciated. But, with everything else being as high quality as it is, we need to make it sound like the band is in the room with us. And with this set of vocal tracks, the best way to do that was boosting some mids, so that's what we did.
If you can find it in your heart, and if you can find it in your heart.
And that did the trick for me. Lastly, the de-esser.
If you can find it in your heart.
So we did that to the main vocal as well as its double. And now we have all the vocals. But we are not done there.
If you can find it in your heart, you're the reason why my world keeps turning. If you can find it in your heart, feels like I know learning.
So, we still have to apply effects for these vocals. Well, and mention this bus. So, scream bus, clean bus, and the pan vocals bus all go to the all vocals bus. That just has some compression, making sure that when these voices overlap, not if, when these voices overlap, that they're still controlled. And then that goes to the pre-master, which then goes through the same chain as all of these, and then to the main. And one thing I should have mentioned when I did that at the ends, but I'll actually go through it now. So, on the mix, when I boosted the highs and the lows, I forgot about the middle, and I wanted to affect that also. Now, this is a free plugin, but there's also a paid version of this plugin that has more knobs than just lows and highs. But I do not have that plugin, so I went with Saturn. And what I did was I wanted to affect the mids. So what I did was I soloed those. And then I'll just copy the settings right now so I keep the mix consistent. I drove the drive all the way up and then I took it down until I stopped hearing distortion. So 54.99, what did I have? 55.19. Okay. But basically, here it is. Like, it just makes the guitars roar through the mix, which is beautiful. So that's what that was. Now, effects bus. We have a couple delays, a couple reverbs, and distortion. For the short delay, I have a Reaper plugin. Now you can download this plugin for free if you want. And what I like about it is that you're able to customize the length of the delay, which I always time to the tempo of the song. For the long delay, we have Sound Toys again, the Echo Boy. And one of the reasons I use Echo Boy is, well, I should say, the reason I'll use that over the Reaper plugin is because if there's a song that has a lot of tempo changes, this will change with the tempo. And that is a huge advantage, unless I wanted to go back to this one and automate it every time. So, short reverb I didn't end up using. I don't know why I still have it there, but we do. The long reverb, we have a Waves plugin. And distortion bus, well, if you don't know, we have Decapitator, all the way at 10 and with a brighter tone. Going into the Devil Lock to even everything out, with a little bit of darkness to make up for some of the added distortion after, and then a little bit of Crush to even it out, with the mix at just over 8. So, that's what we have. And as far as routing, every screaming track goes to all 5 of those. Every clean track goes to every one of them except the distortion bus. And all of the pans tracks only go to the distortion bus. I don't want reverb on the sides of the mix. That wasn't what I was looking for. So, on their own, the effects on their own, here they are. Now, it may be off-putting to hear the effects on their own, but it's fun. Now, if we blend all vocals with it, and then let's just play the entire mix. We have the effects bus here. I'll mute it and unmute it, and it's going to be a subtle change. Keep that in mind. It drives everything forward thanks to the distortion and the delay, and then the reverb gives the vocals their own space so they stand out over the instrumentals. Now, you may think we're done here, and we're not. We have a little bit of automation. And no, I don't mean that as a joke, because I've seen mixes with a lot more. So, first thing, well, actually, the very first thing I did was master fader automation. So the 4 kick drums at the beginning, I made those a little bit of a fade in. And then when everything comes in, we jump up, and you will look at the number here and you will actually see it raise in volume. Now, that's the most effective way I've personally found to make certain parts more impactful, as opposed to creating maybe a sub drop in impacts track. Just raise the volume. It's the easiest way to do it. And we pretty much raise it there, we bring it down in the verses, we keep it the same for the pre-chorus and the chorus. And then the dip here is where there's kind of a break in the song, and then it builds back up and then does a sudden volume jump to lead into the breakdown. So let's take a listen to that. That's that, and then we kind of have another instance.
Just place your trust in me. 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 If you can find it in your heart.
And then you'll notice, even though I pause the song, we hear some of the effects still going. And that's what this effects bus automation is. We just mute those whenever the vocals aren't sounding, so we don't hear it. With the exception for this, where it was vocals only, and I brought it down just a bit, so we didn't hear it as much. Now, for actual automation of the tracks themselves, for the kick, every time there was the beginning of a section, then I automated it up a bit just for additional impacts. Same exact thing with the snare. And then especially where the beginning of the song, everything comes in together, we have a 1.5 decibel boost on the main, and that exact same value here on the kick. So really, you're hearing the kick jump 3 decibels in volume, and then that provides even more of an impact. And that's throughout the entire song. The snare only had two chances of that, so that's what that was. And then remember that low end EQ boost we did for Synth 1? That was to automate the bypass, so whenever the guitars and bass were not playing, then the synth would continue to feed low end into the mix. If you're listening on a good system right now, you'll be able to notice it. And I did that throughout the whole track whenever I could. In Synth 2, there's a part where the song comes at a bit of a standstill, and I automated the fade out of the synth just a little more. So just a little more of silence before the drums come in, and then everything else does. And then without that, I just wanted to create a little more contrast with that. Scrolling down to vocals, we're going to start with volume automation first. This is part of that buildup that was in the main fader automation. Right here, this part. I did that to the vocals also. So what we have is this. And the reason I'm making all of these decisions for automation is because when you hear a recorded song that was done in the studio. That should be the best representation of that should be the band's best performance, because you have control over individual takes, individual elements, everything. However, it cannot be a static performance. You want your listeners to feel the energy as if they were watching this being performed live. So that's why I'm doing all this automation, to help that feeling, especially with the master bus automation. How not the most intense parts, but like the breakdown and the opening with the synths are the loudest, because when the song is opening and that breakdown, those should be the most energetic parts of the song. And volume, in my opinion, is the best way to kind of translate that. So this way it's not just a compressed song, the same volume all the way through. We have some changes in here. So we have a volume boost here, but only on the double. Take a listen. Now, if you notice that, here, it was a main and a double tucked under. But here, if you can see this gray line that comes up, goes all the way to the side, and then back down. That is pan automation. That's also tucked in there. So at this part of the song, it's a main and double. And in this part, they are each, one is pans right, the other is pans left. And they need to be the same volume when they're both panned. So I took the double and I increased it in volume to account for that. And that was done every time the chorus hit. Now, this vocal, kind of the same thing, where they're panned here, based by the same values. And then this one, it is coming off the tail of one scream, so it needed to cut through, and then when the other scream ends, then it could fade back down.
Let me be your haven. World keeps turning.
And that other scream is this one, where we had to duck that down also.
If you can find it in your heart, let me be your haven.
See, and now that automation makes sense.
Let me be your haven.
And then we have vocal right, vocal left, jumping in volume also. So, another thing to mention is that with the clean vocals, whenever the chorus happens, there are screams that go along with it. So let's find that.
If you can find it in your heart, you're the reason why my world keeps turning. If you can find it in your heart, feels like all I know I'm learning.
So, because those screams have to be at the same volume as the cleans, that's where all of this volume automation came from.
If you can find it in your heart, you're the reason why my world keeps turning.
And then the other thing to mention is that, with the exception of these vocals down here, there were not any track names or any mixed notes saying which vocals should be panned and which shouldn't. So I took it upon myself to do what I thought sounded good, which, in my experience, is having a low vocal in the center and then panning the highs. Now, needless to say, if you were working with this band, you need to get their permission or find out what their vision is for the song. Because as the mixer, you serve the bands. So, we can get to the second part, which is the pan automation. And just give me a second while I activate these. I don't think I pans these. Nope, so those can stay off. I know for a fact I did. Alright. So now we have green lines, which represent pan automation. So with what I said about effective vocal layering, at least in terms of screaming, being low vocals in the center and panning the highs, that's basically what this was. So if the line is in the middle, it's in the center. If it pans one way or the other, it's left or right. And you can go through and see where we did that. So like, even though this was labeled main and main double, those were pans left and right the entire time, with the exception of it going in the center for this part. But more so, it just gives the opportunity for more width than trying to just literally stack everything in the center of the mix.
I thought I know all the answers, but now they are lost to me.
So like that part right there, let's put the mix in mono and see if it still has the same impacts.
I thought I know all the answers, but now they are lost to me. I thought I know all the answers, but now they are lost to me.
Like, I love the stereo there. I love it. So, same thing here. These were labeled right and left, and this is where I broke my own rule. Because these were, if these are in the center, these had to be lower vocals, and then these were higher vocals. And so, well, let's listen to mono. Yeah, so an attempt at kind of like a monster sounding vocal there with layering everything. And with the pan automation that I did, yeah, that's just a lot more impactful. So that pattern continues all the way to the chorus. In mono. And then in stereo. So now we're giving the vocals their own space, because the screams are going to cut through the cleans, and then so the screams don't overlap, you just give them their own space by panning them. You know, it's more of a creative solution to the problem. Like, you could, in theory, stack all of these, EQ them different, but I chose not to do that. I wanted to do something that I notice in the songs that I like to listen to, and it ended up working. And the chorus, well, the final chorus, I should say, kind of throws all those rules out the window. So another thing, when I was balancing all these vocals, I found out that I could get 90% of the way there, all of this, and then I would have to automate the last part. So that's how I did it. So let's listen to the acapella and the final chorus.
If you can find it, oh, learn it. If you can find it in your heart, you're the reason why my world keeps turning. If you can find it in your heart, feels like I know learning.
And that's pretty much it. So, we can't just stop there, because now we have to listen to what we've done, which is the best way to end any video. So, once again, if you want to download the tracks for yourself, follow the link in the description. It will take you to another channel where there was someone kind enough to provide them. So let's listen to what we did. There's the mix. Embarrassingly, what I forgot to do is take it out of one-on-one mode, but that would just essentially be exactly what you just heard, just 2.06 decibels higher. So all of that, and we are at 1.5 on the limiter. Now, we could boost this more depending on how loud we want it, but I'm happy with that. So, with that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.